A strange discovery. It was a crisp October morning in the quiet town of Willow Creek, Indiana. The kind of morning where the air felt cool against your skin and the leaves crunched underfoot. Life in this town usually passed at a slow, predictable pace. Neighbors exchanged polite waves from their porches. Dogs barked occasionally as they chased squirrels, and the most dramatic event of the month might be the annual pumpkin festival. That morning, however, something broke the serene rhythm. It started when Mrs. Gladys Porter, the nosy but lovable neighbor, caught a whiff of an unsettling odor drifting from the house down the road. Martha Lee lived there, a widow in her late 50s. It was sour, Gladys would later recount to officers, like something rotting and not just your average garbage smell. Initially, Gladys thought it might be a problem with Martha's garbage bins, maybe some leftover takeout gone bad. But the smell persisted, growing more pungent with each passing day. It seemed to emanate from the backyard, particularly near the tool shed, a small wooden structure Martha rarely used, or so neighbors thought. "I tried to put it out of my mind," Gladys confessed, "but I couldn't stop thinking about it, you know? It was creeping into my yard and I knew something wasn't right." Gladys wasn't the only one to notice. Across the street, retired mechanic Jim Caldwell had been sitting on his porch enjoying his morning coffee when the breeze carried the smell his way. "Something was off," he said, shaking his head. "I figured maybe an animal got into the trash or something died under the deck, but it wasn't a normal smell. You don't forget something like that." The breaking point for Gladys came when her grandson Toby, who was visiting her for the weekend, asked, "Grandma, what's that smell? It's gross." Alarmed, Gladys decided to take a closer look. Armed with her gardening gloves and an iron determination, she walked to the edge of her property and peeked over the chain-link fence separating her yard from Martha's. The sight gave her pause. There was nothing visibly amiss, but an uneasy tension hung in the air, as though the entire yard was holding its breath. Later that evening, as Gladys sat in her living room knitting, the odor wafted through her open window, sharp and unignorable. Worry gnawed at her. It wasn't just a bad smell, it was the kind of stench that suggested decay, the kind that raised alarms deep inside. And that's when she decided it wasn't her problem to solve. It was time to involve the authorities. The call to the Willow Creek Police Department was short, but urgent. "Something's wrong at the Lee house," Gladys told the dispatcher, her voice tight with concern. "There's an awful smell coming from her backyard. I don't know what it is, but it isn't normal. It's been days now." That same evening, Deputy Sheriff Mark Riley and Officer Jenna Hall arrived at the Lee residence. Riley, a steady hand with 20 years on the force, parked the cruiser just past the mailbox. The house stood eerily quiet under the orange glow of the streetlights. A manicured lawn, a modest porch swing, and a single pumpkin sitting on the front steps. The place looked postcard perfect, betraying no hint of the strange happenings within. "Looks innocent enough," Riley murmured, stepping out of the car. But as they approached the property line, the smell hit them, choking and undeniable. Jenna gagged slightly, pulling her jacket up over her nose. "God, what is that?" she asked, her voice muffled. Riley's face tightened. "Let's find out." The officers knocked on the front door, and after a long pause, Martha finally appeared, her face pale and her manner distracted. She greeted them curtly, her eyes darting nervously toward the backyard. When asked about the smell, Martha shrugged, claiming she hadn't noticed anything unusual. "Maybe it's the trash," she said, her voice shaky. "I'll take care of it tomorrow." It was then that Riley's gaze shifted to the backyard. Something about the way Martha blocked the doorway, the faint tremor in her hands, made his instincts flare up. The smell wasn't just trash, and Riley knew it. "Ma'am, mind if we take a look around?" he asked. Martha hesitated, her grip tightening on the edge of the door. But seeing no way out, she reluctantly stepped aside. As the officers made their way toward the backyard, flashlights in hand, the mystery of that strange smell began to unfold, kicking off what would soon become the most unsettling case in Willow Creek's history. A scene full of unanswered questions. The house was tucked away at the end of Sycamore Street, standing quiet and unnervingly still under the golden haze of an autumn sun. It bore no immediate signs of trouble. The flower beds were neatly arranged, albeit with weeds beginning to creep around their edges. The wooden mailbox swayed slightly in the wind, its red flag still upright and waiting. To an outsider, the Lee residence was just another unassuming family home in rural Indiana. But for the two officers standing on the neatly swept porch that day, something about the scene felt off. Deputy Mark Riley adjusted his radio as he stepped forward, eyeing the slightly ajar curtains on the front window. He had seen enough in his 2 decades on the force to know when a house was hiding secrets. Beside him, Officer Jenna Hall tried to quiet the restless tapping of her fingers on her utility belt. She was new to the department, less than a year on the job, and the silence emanating from behind the door was gnawing at her nerves. "You getting that feeling too?" she asked, her voice low. "Yeah," Riley muttered, glancing toward the shadowed backyard. "Something's not right. It's too quiet, too neat." Neatness wasn't usually alarming, but in this case the symmetrical flower pots and meticulously trimmed hedges gave off an almost clinical detachment. It was as though someone had gone out of their way to make the house look ordinary, too ordinary. Riley rapped firmly on the front door, the sound echoed unnaturally, as though the house refused to absorb it. They waited. Nothing. Just as Jenna prepared to suggest circling around the side of the house, there was the soft scrape of footfalls from within. The door creaked open and there she was, Martha Lee. The woman who greeted them was not the composed PTA mom type Riley had expected. Martha was pale, her face drawn tight like a poorly stretched canvas. Her hair was pulled back in a hurried bun, strands frizzing out as if she had abandoned mid-morning chores. But it was her hands that gave Riley pause. They clung to the edge of the doorframe, knuckles white, trembling ever so slightly. "Officers," Martha said curtly, offering a thin, humorless smile. "Can I help you?" Riley kept his tone casual but firm. "Afternoon, ma'am, we're here responding to a call. One of your neighbors mentioned a strong odor coming from your property. Thought we'd stop by, make sure everything's okay." For a split second, something flashed behind Martha's eyes. Panic, hesitation, guilt. Riley couldn't quite pin it down, but he knew that look. He didn't say anything, letting the silence stretch between them. It didn't take long for her to crack beneath it. "Oh, that!" Martha stammered, her fingers flexing nervously against the wood. "I suppose it could be the trash. You know how these things are. Sometimes the garbage company misses a pickup and, well..." Her voice trailed off as she gestured vaguely to the side of the house. Riley nodded slightly, his eyes never leaving her face. "Mind if we take a look around, just to make sure everything checks out?" Martha froze. Her normally pale complexion seemed to lose another shade of color. "The backyard's not really in the best shape right now," she said, chuckling nervously. "I've been meaning to clean up, but with work and it's just been a busy few weeks." Her words spilled out too quickly, like a dam trying to hold back a flood. Riley had heard every excuse in the book, and this one didn't even crack the top 10. "Busy few weeks, huh?" Riley said casually, glancing down at the smudges of dirt on her socks. "Well, we won't take up much of your time, just a quick look around, ma'am, for safety's sake." The shift in Martha's demeanor was almost imperceptible, but Riley caught it, the slight tightening of her jaw, the faint twitch at the corner of her mouth. It was the look of someone who knew they'd been cornered. "I suppose," she mumbled reluctantly, stepping back to let them in. The interior of the house was surprisingly immaculate. Tables and countertops were wiped clean, a vanilla-scented candle flickered on the coffee table, and the light smell of lemon cleaner hung in the air. But something about the scene felt staged, forced. "You keep a nice home, ma'am," Riley said, letting his eyes wander around the living room before resting back on Martha. She didn't respond, glaring instead toward a spot just above his shoulder. Jenna, meanwhile, had wandered toward the kitchen. "Deputy," she called out quietly. Riley followed her voice, his boots clicking softly against the polished wood floors. In the kitchen, Jenna was crouched near the base of the refrigerator, her gloved hand brushing against something smeared faintly across the floor, a dark, rust-colored stain. "Is this—" she began, but Riley raised a hand to stop her. Martha appeared in the doorway, her face unreadable. "Oh, that," she said quickly, her eyes darting. "It's ketchup. Lucas spilled some last week. I thought I scrubbed it all up, but well, you know." Her voice wobbled on the last word. "Lucas?" Riley asked casually. "Your son?" "Yes," Martha replied too quickly. "But he's not here right now. He's been staying with a friend out of town." "For how long?" "Just a few days, maybe a week." The gaps in her story became more and more apparent. Riley glanced at Jenna, who met his eyes with an unspoken understanding. Something wasn't adding up. "We'd like to take a look outside now, ma'am," Riley said firmly, his polite tone giving way to authority. Martha hesitated, standing frozen in the kitchen doorway as though she could physically stop them with her presence alone. For a moment it seemed like she might refuse, but then, with a resigned sigh, she nodded and stepped aside. As Riley and Jenna moved toward the backyard, sunlight streamed onto a patchy lawn bordered by overgrown hedges. What struck Riley first wasn't the yard itself, but the shed at its far corner. The chipped paint and warped wood looked as though they might crumble under a stiff breeze. And of course there was the smell, stronger now, and undeniably closer. Riley stopped at the edge of the shed, glancing back at Martha, who stood stiffly by the back door, her arms crossed defensively over her chest. "Officer Hall," Riley said, gesturing toward the shed. "Mind lending me a hand?" With a deep breath, the two officers stepped forward, unsure of what they'd find inside. Whatever it was, Riley knew one thing for certain: the Lee home's immaculate facade was about to crumble. Clues from the backyard. The October sun hung low in the sky as Deputy Mark Riley and Officer Jenna Hall moved cautiously toward the backyard of the Lee property. The air seemed heavier here, weighted by the unmistakable smell that had been lingering in the neighborhood. It was a sharp, sickly scent that clung to the nostrils, growing stronger with every step. I can't get over how bad this is," Jenna said, pulling her collar over her nose and exhaling through her mouth. "What do you think it is? Trash? A sewer backup?" Riley shook his head, his movements deliberate and calm, as though trying to steady not just himself but also Jenna. "I don't know," he murmured, "but it's not normal. That much I know." The backyard was unkempt, a stark contrast to the house's meticulously cleaned interior. The lawn was patchy, littered with brittle leaves and small tufts of overgrown grass. A rusted swing set tilted precariously on one side, and an old wooden picnic table stood forgotten, its once bright paint now chipped and weathered. In the far corner, a dilapidated tool shed loomed like a forgotten relic of better days. Its door hung slightly ajar, revealing dim shadows inside. The ground around it was uneven, small divots scattered across a patch of dark, damp earth as though someone had been digging, or trying to cover something up. Riley's eyes narrowed as he noticed the shoe prints leading back and forth between the shed and the main yard. The prints overlapped, suggesting repeated trips, and faint drag marks ran parallel to them. "What's that over there?" Jenna asked, motioning with her flashlight toward a pile of what looked like discarded trash bags near the side of the shed. She stepped closer, her boots sinking slightly into the soft ground. "I'd be careful with that," Riley said, tightening his grip on his flashlight. He knelt down near the pile, his keen eyes scanning the surrounding debris. The trash bags were black, the cheap kind that tore easily, and they lay haphazardly, almost as if someone had tried to get rid of them in a hurry but didn't get the chance. Cautiously, Riley used the tip of a stick to nudge the edge of one of the bags. A loud snap broke the silence as the brittle plastic tore, and a waft of the oppressive stench hit them square in the face. Jenna gagged audibly, stumbling back a step. "God, that smell!" she exclaimed, her voice muffled by her sleeve. "What the hell is in these bags?" Riley didn't answer immediately. His gaze was locked on the contents poking through the torn bag, a mixture of dirt, clumps of unidentifiable debris, and what looked like bones. His heart rate quickened, but he forced his voice to remain steady. "Jenna," he said slowly, "radio it in." She hesitated, her hand hovering over her radio as she stared at him with wide eyes. "Bones? Are you saying—" "Just call for backup," Riley interrupted. "Now." Jenna nodded wordlessly, her voice trembling slightly as she relayed the information to dispatch. "This is Officer Hall. We're at the Lee property. Possible human remains in the backyard. Requesting crime scene unit and additional support." As Jenna spoke, Riley moved toward the shed, his boots crunching on the damp ground. The smell seemed to intensify here, seeping through the cracked door. He pushed it open with his flashlight, his other hand instinctively resting on his holster. Inside, the shed was cluttered with old tools and equipment, an aging lawnmower, a rust-encrusted shovel, and several half-empty containers of chemicals. There, in the corner, sat a large, dark barrel. Its lid was askew, revealing a viscous liquid with a deep reddish tint that glowed faintly in the beam of his flashlight. Riley inhaled sharply. "Jenna," he called firmly over his shoulder without turning. "You're gonna want to see this." Jenna hurried toward the shed, cautiously peering over Riley's shoulder. "What is—" She stopped mid-sentence as her gaze fell on the barrel. The liquid inside sloshed slightly, sending out another wave of the pungent odor. This isn't good," Jenna whispered. "No," Riley agreed, his tone grim. "It definitely isn't." He gave the barrel a slight nudge with his flashlight. The liquid lapped against the sides, revealing dark, irregular shapes submerged within. Riley knew better than to poke around further. Whatever was in there would require careful handling by the forensics team. Turning away from the barrel, Riley's gaze swept the shed once more, landing on a discarded pair of gloves tossed haphazardly onto a workbench. They were speckled with dirt and what looked alarmingly like dried blood. Next to them lay a heavily scratched gardening spade, its edges dull but stained with something that looked suspiciously dark. "Looks like someone's been busy," Riley muttered under his breath. Jenna didn't respond. She was still staring at the barrel, her face pale. "Do you think this is—" "I think," Riley interrupted, "we need to question Martha, again." His tone made it clear that the time for tiptoeing around the truth was over. As the two officers stepped back out into the sunlight, Riley cast one last glance at the shed. The smell of decay hung heavy in the air, blending with the crisp autumn breeze in a way that felt entirely wrong, unnatural. At this point, Riley wasn't thinking about trash bags or stray bones anymore. He was thinking about what kind of secrets could drive someone to cover them up so thoroughly. A potentially suspicious witness. As the small Indiana sun dipped lower over Willow Creek, the quiet buzz of gossip had already started to ripple through the neighborhood after the police arrived at the Lee house. It was a small town after all, and even the faintest hint of something unusual could ignite the imaginations of the locals. That's how Deputy Mark Riley and Officer Jenna Hall first came to talk with Jim Caldwell, an elderly neighbor who had been living across the street from the Lee house for nearly 3 decades. Jim was the type of neighbor who noticed everything, but only talked when he thought it mattered. Retired from his long-time job as a mechanic, he spent most of his days sitting on his front porch drinking coffee and keeping an eye on the goings-on of Sycamore Street. Jim greeted Riley and Jenna as they stood by his front lawn, the brim of his dusty baseball cap shading his inquisitive eyes. "Well, I figured something was off," he drawled, leaning against the porch railing. "What did you notice, Mr. Caldwell?" Riley asked, his tone calm but probing. Jim took a deliberate sip of his freshly brewed coffee, glancing pointedly toward the Lee house. "At first it wasn't much. Just odd little things, like how Martha hasn't been putting up her laundry like she usually does. Pretty private woman, that one, but she's got her routines. Always hanging clothes out on Wednesdays, hasn't done it in weeks." Riley tilted his head slightly. "What else?" Jim's eyes narrowed as he thought. "There's the smell, of course, but that's not what got me first. I haven't seen Lucas in what feels like a good while. Kid usually comes around once or twice a day messing with his truck or walking his dog. But lately, nothing. The dog's been quiet too." Jenna couldn't help but interject. "You're sure it's been that long? No sightings of him at all?" Jim scratched his chin slowly, his weathered fingers brushing over coarse stubble. "Well, now that you mention it, there was one night, maybe 2 weeks ago. Heard some loud arguing coming from that direction, the kind that makes you stop what you're doing." This piqued Riley's interest. "And you're certain it came from the Lee house?" Jim nodded. "Clear as day. Could have sworn it was Martha and Lucas going at it. Didn't think much of it at the time, figured it was just family stuff. Happens to the best of us. But the next morning..." He paused, his voice trailing off. "What happened the next morning?" Jenna pressed, shifting her weight slightly. Jim hesitated, his hand gripping the railing tighter. "I saw Martha out back by that old tool shed. She was dragging something, looked heavy, whatever it was. She had this big tarp wrapped up tight like she was hauling trash or something she wanted gone." Riley exchanged a sharp glance with Jenna, his mind processing the new lead. "And you're sure she was alone? No one helping her?" "Not that I could see," Jim replied gravely. "But there's more to it. The tarp. It had these dark stains on it. I'm no detective, but it didn't look like spilled motor oil or anything like that." Jenna's face tightened as she made notes in her small black book. "Did you try asking her about it later or mention anything during the usual neighborly small talk?" Jim let out a soft, humorless chuckle. "Ma'am, Martha's not exactly what you call the chatty type. If you're lucky, you get a wave here and there. But lately, she's been dodging folks altogether. Won't make eye contact, won't return a hello, even for me, and I've been her neighbor for damn near 30 years. "What about her son, Lucas?" Riley asked. "You say you haven't seen him. Could he have gone somewhere?" Jim shook his head firmly. "That boy wouldn't leave his truck and tools. He's a tinkerer. That thing's his pride and joy. And besides, I overheard him telling Martha weeks back that he wasn't going anywhere until they settled things. Whatever that meant." Riley frowned. "Settled what things?" Jim shrugged half-heartedly, lifting his coffee cup like it shielded him from knowing more than he already did. "Your guess is as good as mine, Deputy. All I know is there's been tension brewing over there for a while. Before his dad passed, it was rare to hear much more than a peep out of that house. But lately, yelling matches seemed to be the norm. "What kind of fights?" Jenna asked curiously. "Well, from the snippets I caught, it sounded like it was about money, and I think her wanting to sell the house. Lucas seemed pretty mad about it, kept shouting something like, 'This house is Dad's legacy, you can't just get rid of it.' Thought he might run through the screen door the way he stormed back inside that day," Jim admitted, shaking his head. Riley kept his voice steady, but his gaze sharpened. "Anything else? Anything at all that struck you as odd in the last 2 weeks?" Jim hesitated, then finally leaned forward, lowering his voice almost conspiratorially. "Well, I didn't want to say this, 'cause I'm not one for spreading rumors. But there's been a man visiting her. Not Lucas. This guy drives a beat-up green pickup I haven't seen around before. He usually shows up late at night, stays for a couple hours, then drives off. Saw him twice last week." "Can you describe him?" Riley asked, his tone growing heavier. "Not much to tell," Jim replied, squinting as if trying to recall a blurry memory. "He's a big guy. Beard, maybe in his 40s. I didn't get too good a look. Like I said, it was late. Lights in the house stayed off the whole time he was there too. Thought it was kinda strange." "That's helpful, Jim," Riley reassured him, though his mind raced. A bearded middle-aged man showing up late at night? Another piece of the puzzle, but so far nothing was fitting neatly together. As Jim tipped his cap and headed back inside, Riley turned to Jenna, his expression grim. "Domestic disputes, strange odors, a missing son, and now a mystery visitor? Something's definitely not right here." "I agree," Jenna said, glancing once more at the Lee house across the street. "We need to learn who that man is. He might know more than anyone else." Stepping back toward their cruiser to regroup and call for backup, Riley couldn't shake the uneasy feeling growing in his chest. In small towns like Willow Creek, things didn't just happen without the whole community knowing about it, or so they thought. But the Lee house? It was hiding something, and Riley planned to find out exactly what. Digging deeper. The air inside the Lee house felt stale, thick with the tension of a place that knew it was about to give up its secrets. Deputy Mark Riley stood in the kitchen, his gloved fingers grazing the counter. The faintest smudge of something dark lingered there, blending almost seamlessly with the worn granite. To the untrained eye it might seem meaningless, but to Riley it screamed deliberately cleaned. "This place is too clean," Riley muttered under his breath, glancing at Officer Jenna Hall, who was crouched by the refrigerator again. "Too clean, yeah," Jenna agreed, rubbing a gloved hand along the floor beside the baseboard. She paused when her fingers smeared something faintly brown across a small section of the tile. Brow furrowed, she looked up at Riley. "And not thorough enough." "Blood?" Riley asked, crouching down to inspect the spot. Jenna gave him a guarded look. "Looks like it. Could be old, but it's hard to say without a lab test. Whoever cleaned this spot didn't expect anyone to notice." Riley stood and scanned the kitchen. His eyes moved quickly, taking in the faint scuffs on the floor, the worn broom tucked into the corner, and the slightly damp but odorless mop leaning against the fridge. "Someone put some real effort into this, but half-heartedly," he murmured, like they were in a rush. Jenna rubbed her arms absently as she stood, her boots clicking softly against the tile. "What do you want to bet it's not just the kitchen?" Riley didn't respond immediately. He moved toward the hallway that led to the rest of the house. The walls looked freshly scrubbed, though in faint streaks, and the faint smell of lemon cleaner still clung to the air. Each step seemed heavier than the last, as though the house itself could sense what was about to unfold. The first room they entered was Lucas's bedroom. It was small, cluttered with an odd combination of adulthood and lingering adolescence. The bed was unmade, old car magazines were scattered across a desk to the right, and a half-built model car sat at the center of the same desk. His faded denim jacket hung loosely from the back of a chair. Jenna glanced at the shelves mounted on the wall, stacked with hunting trophies, a few photo frames, and neatly lined-up tools he'd likely tinkered with for his prize truck. "It doesn't look like he left," she said softly. Riley nodded. "No packed bags, everything still in place." He walked to the closet, shining his flashlight inside. The clothes were crammed tightly together, too tightly, as though someone had hastily shoved a few extra jackets and shirts in to make it look fuller. "What are you thinking?" Jenna asked, watching him closely. "I'm thinking someone tried to make it seem like Lucas just vanished," Riley replied. He pressed his hand against the back wall of the closet, spotting a faint scratch in the old wood. He paused, giving it a harder push, and the wood shifted slightly. "Hall, over here." Jenna moved closer, shining her flashlight beside Riley's hand. The panel came loose with some effort, revealing a small hidden compartment. Inside were a box of old letters, a faded photo of Lucas with his father, and a knife, not decorative but functional, a hunting blade still sheathed. Riley pulled the items out carefully, inspecting each one. The letters were signed by Lucas's late father, filled with reminders to take care of the family and protect what matters. Riley's expression hardened. He was the type to hold on to everything that had meaning, Riley murmured. That's not a kid who'd leave all this behind. He stared at the knife for a long moment before looking up at Jenna. Let's keep digging. The next room was the main bathroom, as pristine as the kitchen had been. The tiles gleamed under the yellow-orange light from the overhead bulb. Riley opened the cabinet under the sink, noting the almost empty box of cleaning wipes and a bottle of industrial-strength cleaner usually reserved for heavier messes. Industrial cleaner in a house like this? Jenna said skeptically. You don't use that stuff unless you're trying to scrub away more than soap scum. Riley grunted in agreement as his flashlight caught something behind the pipes, tucked tightly into the shadowy corner. Carefully he reached in and retrieved a small metallic object wrapped in damp paper towels. What is it? Jenna asked, standing beside him as he unwrapped the layers. Riley's face darkened as the final layer revealed its contents, a blood-stained blade with a broken handle. It's not good. The living room and hallway gave up little, stripped down to its most presentable state, likely a distraction for anyone who'd stop by. Riley's frustration grew, along with the ever-present smell that seemed to follow them. It was in Martha's bedroom that everything shifted. Unlike Lucas's room, her space was meticulously organized, almost obsessively so. The bed was neatly made with a floral comforter, fluffed pillows perfectly aligned. But it wasn't the bed that drew Riley's attention, it was the dresser. Jenna was the first to spot the faint scratches around the bottom drawer. Looks like someone was in a hurry to open or close this one, she said, crouching down. Riley knelt beside her. Or they use it to hide something. He gave the drawer a tug, meeting slight resistance before it slid open. Inside were stacks of papers, but beneath them lay something that stopped Jenna in her tracks. What? She started, pulling back carefully. Nestled between an old pair of gloves and another folded tarp was a small plastic evidence bag, inside of which sat a silver ring with the initials LM partially engraved on the band. Riley let out a heavy sigh, recognizing the clasp design immediately. It was Lucas's. This just became a crime scene, he said grimly, standing up. Jenna clicked her penlight off, her face pale. So what now? Riley didn't hesitate. We seal off the house, bring in forensics, and we take Martha Lee into custody. Because Hall, I don't think this is going to end well. As they stepped out of the bedroom, Riley took one last look back at the room before pulling the door shut. The pristine house was nothing more than a facade now, a polished cover for the horrors Riley and Jenna were beginning to piece together. The mysterious lover. The name Edward Green hadn't meant much when it first came up. Just another small-town name in Indiana, someone who lived about 15 minutes outside of Willow Creek. But as Deputy Mark Riley and Officer Jenna Hall dug deeper into the investigation at the Lee property, it became clear that Edward wasn't just a passing acquaintance of Martha Lee. He was someone deeply entangled in her life and potentially her secrets. It all started with that quiet admission from Jim Caldwell, the neighbor who rarely spoke unless there was something worth saying. There's been a man visiting her, Jim had told them, his voice hushed like he was sharing a hometown ghost story. Drives a beat-up green pickup. He usually shows up late at night, stays for a couple hours, then drives off. Seen him twice last week. The detail gnawed at Riley's mind as he and Jenna drove back to the station. Late-night visits. Secretive meetings. The kind of pattern that suggested Martha wasn't as isolated as she wanted people to believe. Think this Edward guy is involved? Jenna asked, her hands gripping the wheel, her forehead creased in thought. Hard to say, Riley replied, gazing out of the passenger side window. The cornfields on the outskirts of Willow Creek rolled past in slow waves. Everything about the town looked ordinary. Quaint white picket fences, lazy smoke curling from chimneys, kids riding bikes. And yet, beneath that surface, one house on Sycamore Street was teeming with darkness. But if he's sneaking around late at night, I doubt he's just dropping off borrowed sugar. Jenna gave a small, humorless laugh. No one's sneaking sugar around in a tarp-stained backyard, deputy. That night, they acted on what little they had, the pickup's description, Jim's vague timeline, and the few scraps of information they'd gleaned from Martha's increasingly cagey answers. Riley hadn't planned on confronting Martha again, not until the forensics reports came back. But Edward Green presented a problem. Someone else who knew something, maybe even too much, and more likely to slip through their fingers if they waited. The following afternoon they followed the breadcrumbs to Edward's address. It was a small, weather-beaten house on the edge of a gravel road lined with dense trees, far enough from Willow Creek to feel isolated. A rusting green pickup truck, just as Jim described, sat in the driveway, its paint flaking off in uneven patches. There were tools scattered haphazardly across the front yard. A half-dismantled chainsaw, a gas can tipped on its side, a few cracked cinder blocks. "Looks cozy," Jenna murmured, stepping out of the cruiser, one hand resting absently on her utility belt. Riley motioned for her to stay a few steps back as he knocked sharply on the door. It took a while for the sound of shuffling feet to echo from inside. When Edward Green appeared, his sheer size filled the doorway. He was broad-shouldered with a thick, unkempt beard that looked like it hadn't seen a trimmer in months. His flannel shirt was askew, and the smell of engine grease clung to him like a second skin. "Can I help you?" he asked gruffly, eyeing the pair of officers with a mixture of suspicion and annoyance. "Mr. Green," Riley started smoothly, his hand still resting at his side where his badge dangled visibly. "Deputy Riley, Officer Hall. We were wondering if you had a moment to answer a few questions." Edward stiffened slightly but nodded toward the porch. "What's this about?" "It's about Martha Lee," Jenna cut in, leaning on her more direct instincts. "We've got reason to believe you've been spending time with her recently. You two seem close." Edward's brow furrowed, and his fingers tightened on the edge of the doorframe. "Yeah, I've been over there. We're friends." Riley raised a curious eyebrow. "Friends? Late at night? No lights on? You seem like a guy with better things to do than make house calls in the dark." Edward's mouth twitched, an expression Riley hadn't missed in 20 years of reading people. It was the look of someone whose house of cards was about to collapse. "She needed help around the place," Edward said quickly, his voice defensive. "She's been selling some of her husband's old things, wanted me to scope out the value of a few items, tools mostly." "And what about the tarp?" Riley asked, his words slicing cleanly through Edward's flimsy story. The bearded man stiffened noticeably, his eyes darting from Riley to Jenna before settling somewhere on the porch floor. "Tarp? I don't know nothing about a tarp." "That right?" Jenna pressed, her tone sharper now. "Because the neighbor across from Martha's house mentioned seeing her dragging a stained one across the yard late one night. Looks heavy. Thought it might have been trash." "That sound like something you might have helped with?" Edward leaned back slightly, his size suddenly seeming more defensive than menacing. He wiped his palms across his jeans, smudging dirt and grease into streaky patches. All right, he muttered, his voice lowering like he was sharing a secret against his better judgment. "Look, Martha's been having a hard time since Lucas left." Jenna stifled a scoff. "Left? You mean disappeared?" Edward shot her a dark look, one heavy enough to make her shift her stance. "She said he was gone," he corrected firmly. "And, yeah, she asked me to help her clean up some stuff in the shed. Offered me cash. I didn't ask why, figured she was clearing out junk." "And you didn't question the smell?" Riley asked, his tone growing colder by the second. Edward's lip twitched again. "She said garbage must have backed up somewhere, sewer maybe. I wasn't about to argue with her, I needed the money." Jenna stepped forward now, her voice carrying a bite. "And you never saw Lucas? Never wondered why a grown man with a truck and tools just vanished without a word?" Edward opened his mouth, but no words came out. For the first time he genuinely looked cornered. Riley, sensing they were close to a crack in the wall, shifted his stance slightly. "Here's the thing, Edward," Riley said, his voice calm but pressing. "You didn't just help her clean out a shed. We know about the backyard, the trash bags, the chemicals in that barrel. So, why don't you tell us what Martha's really got you involved in before this becomes more than a few questions?" The silence stretched. Edward's fingers curled into fists by his side, his shoulders sagging ever so slightly. When he finally answered, his voice was quiet, almost reluctant. She said she didn't mean to do it. Said it was an accident." Riley's gut twisted, but he didn't let it show. "Do what, Edward?" Edward looked up, his face pale beneath the scruff of his beard. A flash of something close to regret flickered in his eyes. "Lucas," he whispered. "It's about Lucas." The property motive. It started as most family disputes do, a quiet disagreement that spiraled over time into something more venomous and irreversible. But as Deputy Mark Riley and Officer Jenna Hall sat in the dimly lit interrogation room at the Willow Creek station, listening to Martha Lee's fragmented confessions, it became painfully clear that this wasn't just about money or family squabbles. It was about something bigger: control, desperation, and loss. "This house," Martha began, her voice trembling as she stared at the table in front of her. Her hands were folded tightly, knuckles white. "It's all I have left. Everything Harry worked for is in it." Her tone wavered, a mixture of defensiveness and sorrow. Riley leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable but his eyes sharp. "And Lucas, he felt the same way, didn't he? That it wasn't just your house, it was his father's legacy." Martha flinched at the word. You don't understand. Lucas wasn't just sentimental about this place. He was stubborn. He thought every creak in the floorboards and every chipped piece of paint was sacred or something, like I didn't have a say in what happened to it." Jenna, sitting quietly to Riley's left, leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped in front of her. "But it wasn't just sentimental, was it? Lucas believed selling the house meant throwing away everything your husband worked for, and that didn't sit well with him." Martha's breathing quickened, her shoulders tightening as though she were reliving the arguments in her mind. "He didn't have to live here," she snapped, her voice suddenly louder. "I did, day in, day out in this crumbling house. You can't understand what it's like to be trapped in that kind of place. Lucas thought it was his right to decide what happened, but he wasn't the one left to clean up the debts." "Debts?" Riley interjected, his voice calm but calculated. "You mean the repairs? Property taxes?" Martha hesitated before nodding slowly. "It's not just the taxes. There's the mortgage, loans Harry took out before he passed. I can't keep up. I'm drowning in it." "So you decided to sell," Riley said, finishing her sentence for her. His tone was steady, but there was a subtle edge to it. "And Lucas didn't agree." Martha's lips pressed into a thin line, her face crumpled slightly as her composure began to crack. "He wouldn't listen," she whispered. "Whenever I brought it up, he'd go on these rants about how I was betraying Harry's memory, how I was selfish. He said if I tried to sell the house, She stopped herself abruptly, her hands trembling where they rested on the table. "You'd what?" Jenna pressed gently but firmly. "What did Lucas say, Martha?" Martha's eyes darted toward Jenna, her face pale. "He said he'd stop me," she admitted in a quiet, hoarse voice. "No matter what it took. He even—" She broke off, biting her lip hard enough that Jenna thought it might bleed. Riley glanced at Jenna, sharing a silent understanding before looking back at Martha. "He threatened you, didn't he?" Martha didn't answer immediately. Her gaze dropped to the tabletop, her voice a whisper when she finally spoke. "He said I wasn't fit to make decisions anymore, that I'd ruin everything. He said he'd take me to court if I tried to sell it without his permission." Her voice cracked, and the words spilled out faster now. "You don't understand. This house was suffocating me, but Lucas wouldn't let it go. He wouldn't listen." Riley's brow furrowed, his pen tapping lightly against the small notepad in front of him. "So you fought. How often?" "Every time it came up," Martha said bitterly, her voice growing sharper. "It got worse after his father died. Lucas blamed me for everything, for the money problems, for not honoring Harry's memory. As if I didn't keep every single thing going after Harry was gone." "And the last fight?" Jenna asked calmly, though she felt the tension in the room growing. She could see Riley's jaw tightening out of the corner of her eye. Martha froze, visibly shaken by the question. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. The silence stretched between them for a long, uncomfortable moment until Riley finally broke it. "Something happened during that fight, didn't it, Martha?" His voice was low, almost a murmur, but it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken accusations. "It wasn't just a shouting match this time." Tears began to brim in Martha's eyes as her body sagged against the back of her chair. She looked tired, older than the woman Riley had first seen at the Lee property. Her hands flew to cover her mouth for a moment before she finally let the words escape. "He came at me," she choked out. "I was just trying to make him see reason, but he wouldn't stop yelling. He pushed me, hard. My head hit the wall and I just snapped. I wasn't thinking. Jenna leaned closer, her voice soft but firm. "Martha, what happened?" Martha's breath hitched as she buried her face in her hands. "There was a fireplace poker. It was right there by the mantel. All I wanted was for him to stop." Riley's heart sank as the pieces began to fit together. He could see the full scene playing out in his mind, the shouting, the pushing, the overwhelming rage in the heat of the moment. "He fell," Martha sobbed. "He fell so hard. I didn't mean for it to happen. I swear to God I didn't. But when I saw him on the ground there was so much blood and he wasn't moving and—" She trailed off into a wave of choking sobs. "I didn't know what to do." "So you decided to cover it up," Riley said, his voice now colder, sharper. Martha nodded weakly, barely lifting her head. "I panicked. I thought no one would believe me. I dragged him outside to the shed and I wrapped him up. I kept telling myself I'd call someone, but I couldn't." Her voice drifted off again, lost amidst the tide of her grief. Jenna exchanged a heavy look with Riley. The financial pressure, the looming debts, and Lucas's resistance to selling, it had all created a powder keg. And, as they'd suspected, the fight over the house had ignited it. As Riley rose from his chair, he glanced back at Martha with a cool finality in his eyes. "Martha Lee, you're under arrest for the murder of Lucas Lee. Crucial evidence." The evidence that would unravel everything came slowly, like puzzle pieces falling into place one maddening piece at a time. But with every grim discovery, it seemed increasingly clear that the truth surrounding Lucas Lee's disappearance wasn't just tragic, it was chilling. The day started quietly, as most in Willow Creek did, with the kind of crisp Indiana air that hinted at the coming winter. But back at the station, forensic results had just arrived, and Deputy Mark Riley and Officer Jenna Hall leaned over the cold gray desk in the evidence room, their eyes scanning the detailed printouts in silence. Every few seconds Jenna would glance at Riley, waiting for his reaction to the damning information now staring them both in the face. "It's him," Jenna finally said, her voice low and somber, breaking the silence. Riley let out a heavy exhale through gritted teeth, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's him," he echoed grimly, as if saying it aloud made it more permanent. Forensics had confirmed it. The fragments of bone found inside the barrel at the Lee property matched Lucas Lee's DNA. The dark, viscous liquid in the barrel, partially concealing the remains, wasn't just decomposing organic material. Chemical analysis revealed it as an industrial-grade solvent, the kind used to strip paint, or in this case, hastily dispose of a body. "Whoever did this," Jenna trailed off, shaking her head, "they weren't just trying to hide him, they wanted to erase him." Riley pushed the report to the side and leaned forward, his elbows resting heavily on the desk. "It's more than that. This wasn't random. This was thought out. That shed, the gloves, the chemicals, hell, even the trash bags. They tried to cover every base, but they missed just enough. It wasn't just the barrel. Forensics had also flagged the gardening spade found inside the shed, its edges dull but laced with microscopic traces of Lucas's blood. Riley had already pictured it in his mind, the hurried movements, the panic, and the attempt to bury secrets in the quiet backyard of a suburban street. But the evidence couldn't be buried. It spoke for itself, and it spoke volumes. Then there was the ring. The small silver band etched with the initials LM was unmistakably Lucas's. A personal object no one else should have had. Found carefully hidden in a bottom dresser drawer in Martha Lee's room, it had a smudge of dried blood just visible under lab lights. Inside that same drawer was a folded tarp, soiled, stained, and practically humming of decay. Forensics confirmed the presence of DNA from Lucas, along with smaller, unidentifiable substances that hinted at rushed attempts at cleanup. "Who hides that kind of evidence in their own damn house?" Jenna muttered aloud, pacing the room. "If you're trying to cover up a crime, you'd think you wouldn't keep trophies in your damn dresser drawer." "She panicked," Riley said quietly. Jenna froze mid-step, turning to face him. "What?" "She screwed up because it wasn't planned. Not the killing, at least," Riley clarified. He ran a hand along his jaw as he worked through his thoughts out loud. "She didn't mean to." That night, whatever happened between her and Lucas, it escalated. She snapped, and once it was done, once he was gone, she had to figure out what to do. That's when she started thinking, cleaning, hiding. "But not burying," Jenna pointed out. "Why not bury him? If you're gonna try to hide evidence, why leave all this behind?" Riley glanced at her, his eyes sharp but heavy with unspoken weariness. "Think about it, Hall. Winters here freeze the ground solid. No matter how angry, no matter how desperate she wasn't getting far digging in the backyard. The shed becomes the only option." Jenna folded her arms tightly, glancing down at the photos laid out on the desk. One showed the shed in its entirety, another zoomed in on the barrel and the rusted gloves tossed just feet away. Beside that image were snapshots of the tarp pulled from the dresser, meticulously catalogued, and now serving as a damning witness to Martha's guilt. "And yet she called Eddie," Riley added, his voice now low, almost growling. "Edward Green. In the web of lies surrounding the case, he was the one thread that kept coming unraveled. Forensics had also lifted partial prints from the gloves and from the barrel itself. Most belonged to Martha, but one clear set matched Edward's thumb." "So he knew," Jenna said bitterly. "Knew?" Riley narrowed his eyes. "Hall, Eddie didn't just know, he was involved. And that means we've got an accomplice." Jenna shook her head as she paced again. "It's unbelievable. How do you get someone to be part of this? Hey Eddie, want to come by later and help me clean up after I—" "What? How do you even approach someone with that?" Riley stood now, adjusting the cuffs of his long-sleeved shirt and taking the photos in hand. Desperation, leverage, Eddie's in on this because Martha needed him, and because he didn't think anyone would ever find out, whatever it took to keep their secret locked in that backyard. The conversation came to a halt as the door opened and Detective Whitaker poked his head through. He held more forensics results in his hand, his face shadowed with an uneasy expression. Without a word, he set the papers down on the desk between Riley and Jenna. "Read this," he said, simply but sternly. Riley's jaw tightened as he scanned the paper, his lips pressing into a hard line. Among the newly discovered items from the Lee property was another blood-stained object, a shattered ceramic figurine, ornamental and likely innocuous but now anchored in dark significance. Traces of blood matched Lucas's DNA. "It was in the kitchen," Whitaker said grimly, "behind the stove." Riley exhaled sharply, his irritation rising to the surface. "So, first a fireplace poker, now a piece of ornamental junk? What was she doing swinging whatever was closest?" Jenna didn't respond. She was still staring at the figurine, her thoughts clearly racing. Finally she spoke. "Maybe that's all we need though. Even if she calls it an accident, the evidence says she kept going. Once might have been a mistake, twice isn't." Riley nodded. "It's time we take what we have into the interrogation room before anyone else tries to bury more evidence." Edward's involvement. Edward Green wasn't easy to read. He sat slouched in the cold metal chair of the interrogation room, his thick arms crossed over his chest, eyes darting between Deputy Mark Riley and Officer Jenna Hall. His broad-shouldered frame looked out of place under the harsh fluorescent lights. The faded flannel shirt he wore had grease stains on the sleeves, and he exuded the smell of sweat and engine oil. To most, he'd seem like just another rough and tough guy trying to keep his life running. To Riley he looked like a man holding on to secrets. Riley leaned forward, resting both arms on the table between them. His tone was calm, deliberate. "Edward, we're not here to waste your time, and I hope you're not about to waste ours. We already know you were at the Lee property. Your prints are all over that barrel." Edward's mouth twitched, his eyes flickering to Jenna, who stood leaning against the far wall. Her arms were folded, her expression unreadable, her gaze fixed on Edward like she wouldn't let him escape even his own excuses. "I don't know what you're talking about," Edward muttered, his tone low but defensive. Riley raised an eyebrow, pulling out a folder filled with photos. He slid one across the table, a close-up image of the barrel in the corner of the shed. The discolored gloves, the sticky residue along the edges of the industrial chemicals, and the unmistakable partial thumbprint circled in red told their own story. "That's not your glove?" Riley questioned. "Your fingerprint just happened to jump on that barrel?" "I helped her clean some junk," Edward mumbled, his shoulders stiffening. His fingers tapped nervously against the cold metal of the table. "That's it." "Junk," Jenna repeated, her voice cutting through the growing tension. "Funny, because we're not finding any boxes of old tools or broken furniture in that shed. What we are finding—" She stepped closer, placing her hands on the back of the chair directly opposite Edward. Her voice grew sharp. "Is human remains, Edward. Lucas Lee's remains." Edward flinched, his jaw tightening as if he'd been punched in the stomach. I don't got anything to do with that." His words came out quickly now, tumbling over each other like they were trying to escape his lips faster than he could stop them. "Edward," Riley said, his voice firm, measured, but with a current of steel running beneath it. "You're in this, whether you like it or not. Right now, the only question is how much you're in this. Helping with cleanup? Yeah, you're already in trouble. But if you had anything to do with what happened to Lucas—" He paused, letting the implication hang heavy in the room. "Then believe me, this isn't going to end well for you." Edward was quiet for a long moment, his mind visibly racing. His fingers twitched again on the table and his eyes darted between Riley and Jenna like a cornered animal. "I didn't hurt him," Edward finally said, his voice slightly louder now, filled with desperation. "I swear to God, I didn't lay a finger on that boy." "Then why the hell did you help her?" Jenna snapped suddenly, her frustration breaking through. "Do people just call you up to deal with dead bodies on a regular Wednesday night, Edward? Or was there more to this?" Edward glared at her, his jaw tightening, but he didn't respond immediately. His breath hitched slightly, and Riley could feel the crack forming. "Talk, Edward," Riley said evenly, "because this is your one shot to explain what came before we found your name written all over this mess." Edward grimaced, his hands balling into fists on the table. "I didn't know what to do, all right," he said finally, anger and fear rolling together in his voice. "She called me. She sounded panicked, said there was an accident, said she couldn't handle it alone. I didn't ask for details." Jenna's voice was sharp when she cut in. "Don't give me that. Anyone who walks into that shed knows what a dead body smells like. Are you seriously trying to tell us you just looked the other way?" Edward leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his gritty beard. His foot tapped nervously against the floor. I don't know, man. I thought it wasn't what it looked like. She said she just needed help cleaning up. I figured maybe some stray animal or something got into her yard." Riley leaned in closer now, his eyes narrowing. "Stray animal? Edward, come on. You're telling me you walked into that shed, cleaned gloves, handled that barrel, and you didn't think for 1 second you were dealing with a person? Do you know what a solvent like that does to a body?" Edward's hands spread flat on the table, his breathing growing heavier. "I didn't know," he spat, his eyes wide like a man about to lose it. "She told me to leave when I saw those bags. She said she'd handle the rest. I left, all right? I didn't ask questions." "You didn't ask questions because you already knew," Riley said coldly. His voice dropped lower, cutting through Edward like a surgical blade. "You knew exactly what was in those bags." Edward's eyes darted to the side as if looking for an escape route that didn't exist. "She promised me it wouldn't come back on me," he confessed in a hoarse whisper. "Let me guess," Jenna said with a bitter laugh. "And what did you get in return for your silence, Eddie? Was it money, or was it something a little more personal?" Edward froze, his gaze snapping to Jenna. His face flushed a deep red, but he didn't say a word. "Ah," Riley said, tilting his head. "It's starting to make sense now. You weren't just there because Martha needed help, were you? You were there because you've been involved with her. Don't bother denying it, we've already put the pieces together." Edward stammered, frustration mounting in his voice. "That has nothing to do with Lucas. She told me it was an accident. She said he started yelling, shoved her and then what?" Jenna interrupted, her voice sharp. "She panicked and bashed his head in? You don't think that's something worth telling us?" Edward slammed his fists on the table, his eyes blazing. "I didn't know what to do!" he roared. For a moment the room was silent except for his heavy, uneven breathing. Then his voice broke. "I didn't want to get involved, all right? She begged me. She said if anyone found out, she said she'd make sure I went down for it too." "You're already down for it, Edward," Riley said coolly, standing up. "The question is, are you going to keep lying for Martha, or are you going to finally tell us the truth about what really happened to Lucas Lee?" Edward leaned forward, his head hanging between his shoulders. His voice was barely audible as he spoke. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. It wasn't supposed to go this far. Riley exchanged a quiet glance with Jenna. They both saw the walls closing in around Edward Green, and knew it was only a matter of time before the whole story came out, piece by nauseating piece. Confession and sentencing. The interrogation room at the Willow Creek station was unbearably still, the harsh fluorescent lights humming faintly in the silence. Martha Lee sat slumped in the chair, hands clenched on her lap, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. Across from her sat Deputy Mark Riley, calm, steady, though his eyes carried the weight of the evidence stacked against her. Officer Jenna Hall lingered against the wall, her arms crossed, a quiet determination etched into her face. Riley leaned forward slightly, his voice soft but firm. "Martha, we're running out of time here. We already know what happened to Lucas. What we need from you now is the truth. Why? How?" He exhaled slowly, letting the pause linger in the air. "Tell us how it ended up like this." Martha's fingers trembled against her lap, her nails digging into the fabric of her skirt. I don't know where to start," she whispered, her voice breaking under the strain of her words. "Start with the night Lucas died," Jenna said sharply from the corner. Her eyes pinned Martha to her seat like a hawk circling weak prey. "You've been dragging this out long enough. No more excuses, no more half-truths. Tell us the whole thing." Martha's gaze darted toward Jenna, then back down to the table in front of her. She looked like a dam about to burst, holding back waves of guilt and grief. Finally, she spoke, her voice thick and uneven. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," she began, her hands now clenching into fists. He just wouldn't stop. He kept yelling at me, going on and on about the house, about Harry, about how I was ruining our family's name. Like it was my fault." Riley nodded gently, his tone even. "And that's when it escalated?" Martha shook her head, tears spilling over now as she sniffled and fought to steady her voice. "He was calling me things, awful things. He said I was pathetic, that Dad would be ashamed of me, that I was a coward for selling the house. God, he wouldn't stop. I just wanted him to stop." Her voice was rising now, each word coming faster, cracked and heavy with emotion. Jenna straightened from her position near the wall, stepping forward and fixing her gaze on Martha. "So you grabbed the poker, didn't you?" she said, cutting straight to the heart of the matter. Martha froze, her breath hitching in her chest. Riley watched her carefully, his pen lightly tapping against the table. The silence sat like a weight between them until Martha finally nodded, her voice reduced to a hoarse whisper. "It was right there, by the fireplace. He backed me into the corner. She broke off, sobbing into her hands. "I wasn't thinking. I picked it up and I swung it." Riley leaned back slightly, giving her room to continue. His tone grew firmer now, guiding her toward the full truth. "Where did you hit him, Martha? What happened after that?" "I didn't mean to!" she cried suddenly, louder than either of them had expected. Her red-rimmed eyes shot up to meet Riley's, pleading, "I swear I didn't mean to. I just wanted him to stop screaming." "Martha," Jenna said, her voice sharp but measured, "you hit him. Where?" Martha's shoulders sank as though the weight of her actions had finally collapsed onto her. She looked away as she choked out, "His head. The side of his head. He was—" Her voice faltered. "He fell so hard, there was blood everywhere. I didn't know what to do." Riley closed his eyes briefly, steeling himself before pressing on. "What did you do next?" She shook her head vigorously, rocking slightly in her seat. "I panicked. I thought, oh God, I thought he was dead. I tried shaking him, calling his name, but he wouldn't wake up." She swallowed hard, her next words barely a whisper. "I dragged him outside, to the shed. I just kept thinking, I have to hide him. I have to fix this." "And the barrel?" Riley asked, his voice tightening. He slid a photo of the chemical barrel across the table. The image, the blackened steel sides, the viscous liquid inside, caused Martha to recoil. "I didn't plan that," Martha stammered, her breath quickening. Edward brought it. He said he'd help me. He told me it would make everything go away." "Edward Green didn't just help you, Martha," Jenna interrupted harshly, any patience in her tone long gone. "He moved your son's body, hid it, dumped chemicals on it, and left it to rot in a barrel in your shed. That's not helping. That's covering up a murder." Martha flinched at the word murder, as though it was a blade cutting across her skin. She shook her head again, her sobs growing uncontrollable. "It wasn't supposed to go this far. I didn't want this. You didn't want your son's death, is that it?" Riley asked coldly, leaning forward now, his voice hard as steel. "You didn't want his rotting remains sitting in your backyard, but that's where we found him, isn't it? Don't pretend this wasn't your decision, because everything in that shed says otherwise." "I thought it was the only way!" Martha screamed, her face twisted in anguish. "I thought no one would believe me. Lucas wasn't easy to live with. He was angry all the time, always blaming me for losing Dad, for the debts, for the house. I thought—" She paused, shaking her head. "I thought they'd say I did it on purpose." Jenna sat heavily in the chair opposite Martha, locking eyes with her. "Martha, we've heard enough. You can call it whatever you want, an accident in the heat of the moment, panic, self-preservation. But the evidence says it all. Lucas is dead because of you. And Edward Green? He may have helped you clean up the mess, but this guilt? That's all on you." The room fell silent again, save for the sound of Martha's sobs echoing against the concrete walls. Riley finally stood, straightening his tie with a tense expression. His voice was low but resolute. "Martha Lee, you're under arrest for the murder of Lucas Lee. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The sentencing itself came weeks later, but the confessions made everything clear to the jury. Martha Lee was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for first-degree murder, while Edward Green faced 25 years for his role as an accessory. The residents of Willow Creek never looked at the Lee house the same way again. Once a quiet, unassuming family home, it became a reminder of how desperation and rage could reduce a family to ashes. Public reaction and lessons learned. The town of Willow Creek simmered with tension in the weeks that followed the Lee case. What had once been a quiet, idyllic Indiana town was now the center of whispered conversations, harsh judgment, and unease. People who lived for years without locking their doors suddenly found themselves rechecking their locks, double-checking their windows. The sight of the police cruiser parked outside the Lee house had left an imprint on the neighborhood's collective mind. At Jerry's Diner, the town's unofficial hub for both blueberry pie and gossip, the chatter about the case was relentless. It wasn't big city drama. Murder was something people only read about in the paper or saw on TV, but now it was right on Sycamore Street, too close for comfort. You ever get a feeling like someone's hiding something but you're too polite to call them out? Said Ruth Calhoun, who'd spent 50 years running the convenience store on Maple Street. Her voice was loud enough that no one in the booth behind her could avoid listening. I mean, Martha never looked the type, did she? Always so quiet in church. Sitting across from her was Joe Sanders, the mechanic whose shop was down the street from Jim Caldwell's house. He nodded, dunking his coffee-soaked biscuit into his cup. Quiet ones. Ain't it always the quiet ones? He sighed, his thick fingers tracing the chipped edge of his mug. But here's my question. How does a mother, how could you, to your own kid? Makes me sick. Not just her, Ruth said quickly. That Edward Green boy, oh, he's as much to blame as her. Why would anyone go along with a thing like that? He should have turned her in instead of dragging that poor kid's body around the backyard. It's sick, I'm telling you. Just plain sick. The conversation carried on like that daily. Bits of judgment laced with shock, mixed with fear and speculation. The townsfolk's carefully curated image of themselves as a close-knit, upstanding community had been shattered, leaving them scrambling to understand not just the event, but themselves. Out on Sycamore Street, Jim Caldwell found himself reluctantly becoming the spokesperson for the neighborhood. A steady stream of newspapers, local reporters, and even one regional TV outlet had stopped by his porch. They all wanted the same thing, his reaction. I never thought something like this would happen here, Jim said into a tape recorder one afternoon, his eyes drifting toward the now-empty Lee house across the street. The once neatly trimmed yard was overgrown now, with police tape still fluttering faintly on the outskirts of the property. Sure, folks argue, families fight, but this is evil, plain and simple. When asked what the town could learn from such tragedy, Jim scratched at his chin and leaned back in his porch chair. Well, he began slowly, I guess people forget that just 'cause someone looks normal on the outside, don't mean they don't got darkness tucked away. You see someone grocery shopping or smiling in church, you can't know what's happening behind their doors, can you? It wasn't long before the case became something bigger than just the local concern of Willow Creek. It was picked up by larger news stations, plastered across headlines as an example of suburban tragedy. Mother's rage, how desperation turned deadly. Experts and investigators alike hopped onto talk shows to dissect it. Psychologists speculated about the pressures Martha felt, a widowed woman in debt, trapped in a house she couldn't afford but couldn't emotionally abandon. Sociologists pointed to the strain that generational legacies and family rifts could place on people, especially in small-town America where reputation often means everything. To many in the country, the Lee case became cautionary, a reminder of how anger, misunderstood intentions, and unresolved family disputes could tear lives apart. To those in Willow Creek, though, it wasn't just a headline. It was personal. It's the sort of thing that makes you reevaluate, said Susan Walters, who ran the local catering service and counted both Martha and Lucas as past clients. You think about the people you've known for years, your neighbors, your friends, even your family, and you wonder if you've been missing the signs. Could we have done something? Could anyone have helped her before this? Others weren't as introspective, leaning instead into melancholy resignation. You think you know your neighbors, muttered Harold Jenkins, who delivered mail on Sycamore Street, shaking his head over a third beer at Sammy's pub. But at the end of the day, you don't know nothing. And what's worse is, you probably never cared enough to ask. Still, not everyone in the town was content with the shared guilt. This is a perfect example of how everyone minds their own damn business too much, said Claire Melton, a community organizer. How many of us actually bothered to check in on her, to say, hey Martha, do you need help with the debts? Do you need someone to talk to? We saw her struggling and we looked the other way. That's why this happened. As seasons passed, Willow Creek inevitably tried to move on, but the Lee house remained a conspicuous scar, silent, abandoned, its windows boarded up after a short-lived auction attempt fell through. No one wanted to live there. The town church began incorporating messages into its sermons about family reconciliation and managing anger. We are servants to love, Pastor Callahan had said during one particularly poignant service. And when we abandon that service, when we lose control, we can lose everything. Our families, our future, ourselves. Don't wait until the arguments and the fights grow too big to overcome. Seek peace, forgiveness. For years, the Lee tragedy lingered like a ghost in the cracks of Willow Creek. People retold the story like folklore, an eerie reminder of how something so horrific could happen so close to home. But whether they saw it as a tale of warning or a tale of regret depended on who you asked. For Riley and Hall, though, the case was less about the what and much more about the why. Driving back from a follow-up lead one autumn afternoon, Riley broke the silence in the car. "You ever think about where things went wrong?" he asked, his hands gripping the wheel loosely. Jenna, glancing out the window, folded her arms. "For Martha? For Lucas? For everything. The house, the family, all of it." Jenna tilted her head, pondering his question. She never asked for help, and the people who might have been paying attention probably just assumed she was doing fine. That's the thing about people like her. They suffer in silence because they've got too much pride or fear to admit they're drowning. Riley nodded slowly. "Guess that's the tragedy of it all, isn't it? No one says anything until it takes someone dying to make people notice." Jenna exhaled deeply, her breath fogging up the passenger window, as the first signs of snowfall dusted the fields along the road. "The real lesson here? Check in on people. Ask the questions, even if they don't want to hear them. You might just stop something before it starts." And though they turned onto the main highway toward the station, both knew that the small town of Willow Creek, and the people within it, would never fully be the same. Justice is served, but the pain remains. October 1992, nearly a year after the first scream shattered the sleepy serenity of Hollow Creek, justice was finally served. Will Carter, the man who had terrorized the town and irrevocably altered its course, was formally sentenced to death for his crimes. Families packed the courtroom, their faces pale but resolute. For many, it felt like the conclusion to a chapter they had desperately needed to close. For others, however, it changed little. Lisa Carter would never come home. Mark Benson's laughter would never echo through Monroe's general store again, and Sarah Peterson's garden would remain untended, its flowers soon swallowed by weeds. Hollow Creek had survived the unimaginable, but nobody could call it whole. The scars left behind weren't just on the people who had directly suffered, they were carved into the soul of the town itself. The trial of a monster. The trial began in late August and quickly became the talk of every diner, church meeting, and front yard barbecue across Idaho. News vans circled Hollow Creek like vultures, their cameras capturing every painful sob from the grieving families and every furtive glance exchanged between neighbors who still struggled with lingering suspicion. Victims' parents, siblings, and friends piled into the courtroom every morning, dressed in somber black, their faces a mask of anguish as they were forced to relive the details of Carter's carnage. Sheriff Dale Parker testified first, his gravelly voice steady despite the emotion clawing its way through him. He recounted the events of the search, carefully describing the evidence they'd gathered, the grueling manhunt through the woods, and ultimately, the moment Will Carter had been brought down. When Parker was questioned directly about how he felt when Carter surrendered, his jaw visibly clenched. "How I felt," he echoed, his voice low and measured. "I felt sick. Sick because this man had taken everything good and decent in our town, people's lives, their peace, their sense of safety, and crushed it. And we were left to pick up the pieces." The courtroom held its breath. Somehow, Parker's words held more weight than all the clinical evidence the prosecution had laid out. Everyone knew that if this trial symbolized justice, Parker symbolized the raw, bleeding heart of Hollow Creek, still fighting to hold everything together. Julian Keene, the FBI agent who had spent months building the case against Carter, was a more detached figure on the stand. But even he couldn't mask his disdain for the man sitting across the room. "Will Carter is not a tragic product of circumstance," Keene said with cold precision. "He is a predator, calculating, remorseless, and fully aware of the pain he caused. He didn't just kill these victims, he toyed with their lives and he toyed with all of you." All eyes fell on Carter, who rarely spoke during the trial. His public defender had advised him to minimize his appearances, his outbursts, and his rage. And yet throughout the proceedings he often gazed blankly at the grieving families, his expression hollow but unyielding. Rumors swirled of smirks caught when certain photographs were presented in evidence, further fueling the hatred his name had already garnered in every household across Hollow Creek. Justice in name, not in healing. When the verdict came down on the cool October morning, guilty on all counts, the penalty, death, there was no celebration. There was no applause, no satisfying catharsis. For most gathered at the courthouse, the decision was met with silence. The low hum of people murmuring and comforting one another was the only sound as Carter was led away in chains. Donna Carter, mother of Lisa, was caught by reporters as she exited the courtroom. Tears streamed down her face as she spoke, her voice trembling. "I won't call this justice. It's just something. It doesn't bring Lisa back. It doesn't undo this pain, but maybe it'll stop someone else's family from feeling the way I feel right now." Pete Carter, Lisa's father, said nothing. He simply stared at the sky, his lips tight and his hands shaking as he rested them on the hood of his dusty old truck. Whatever he had to say about forgiveness, or lack of it, remained locked inside. Martha Benson, Mark's mother, had sat silently in the back row of the courtroom for most of the trial, clutching the cross around her neck so tightly the indentations remained visible in her palm. She had looked at nothing but the floor when the verdict was read. "Justice," she said later to a local news anchor, her voice distant. "Justice doesn't make you whole. Justice just makes you able to sleep again, most nights." For Sheriff Parker, the sentencing wasn't an ending at all. It was the end of a hunt, yes, but the wounds Carter had left behind weren't Carter's to heal. He hadn't seen Sarah's students trying to process their grief in the shadow of her empty desk. He hadn't walked over Hollow Creek's cobblestone streets and felt the strange, bitter silence where laughter and life used to thrive. No, justice wasn't enough because it couldn't fix what had been ruined. Hollow Creek. After the storm, long after Carter had been transferred to a maximum security prison, the town still carried his shadow. Hollow Creek, once the embodiment of an idyllic small-town postcard, was now a place of shuttered windows and hesitant smiles. The scars ran deep. The general store, once bustling with neighbors gossiping over their morning coffee as Mark rang up bags of sugar and flour, now felt eerily quiet. A small framed photo of Mark Benson stood near the register, dusty and untouched save for the occasional visitor who stopped to say hi to the memory of a good man taken too soon. The elementary school, where Sarah Peterson had so passionately taught history, tried to preserve her legacy. The students planted a garden in her memory, bright flowers arranged in neat rows just outside the playground, but every time someone walked by, it was hard not to notice the weeds slowly creeping into the soil, as if no amount of care could truly preserve what had been lost. And Lisa Carter, the heart of the small hardware store, the girl with big dreams that everyone had rooted for, was mourned daily. Her family never quite recovered, and her absence was a constant ache when they passed her empty room or drove by the parking lot where her life had ended. Even Parker himself began to struggle. The job, once second nature, now wore him down like a lead weight. Everyone in Hollow Creek still waved to him on the street, tried to smile when he stopped by their shops or homes, but behind every smile, he saw the lingering doubt, the pain, the questioning. Why couldn't this have ended differently? For Parker, the answer was both simple and impossible, because it wasn't possible to stop all monsters before they hurt someone. You could only catch them after the damage was done, trying to move forward. Still, not all was lost. Hollow Creek, battered as it was, began slowly rebuilding what it could. The church held candlelight vigils every December to honor Sarah, Mark, and Lisa. On Sundays, Pastor Willingham spoke of resilience, of enduring the worst life had to throw. "This town may never go back to what it was," he once said during an Easter sermon. "But that doesn't mean we can't be something just as strong, something forged by what we've been through." The first summer after Carter's sentencing, the town festival was held for the first time in 2 years. Families gathered hesitantly beneath strings of fairy lights, sipping lemonade and listening to live music from the high school band. It wasn't perfect. Children clung to their parents longer than usual, and the laughter wasn't as full as it used to be, but it was a start. Parker, sitting at a corner table under the old oaks near the festival's edge, watched the town he had poured his life into. It wasn't whole, he realized. It probably never would be, but it could heal, little by little. And maybe one day, Hollow Creek might even feel alive again. "Here's to a new beginning," Wallace said softly as she joined him at the table, holding 2 paper cups of coffee. Parker nodded, staring out at the flickering festival lights. "New beginning," he repeated, though the ache in his chest told him it would take a long, long time for that to feel true.